Channel open. Welcome back to WeeklyTrek, a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions podcast network and presented in partnership with TrekCore.com. I am your host, Alex Perry.
What's today's date? The date.
Today's show was recorded on January 21st, 2023, and is current through Star Trek Prodigy Season 1, so beware of spoilers. All right, let's get into the show.
Good day, Voyager, and welcome to A Briefing with Neelix. It's a catchy title, isn't it?
Weekly Trek is a regular news show covering the biggest stories from the Star Trek franchise. We are in a new golden age of Star Trek. There are 5 television shows in production, possibly more on the way, and enough merchandise to fill the Bajoran wormhole. So stick with me and I'll help you sort the real facts from a lot of the Dominion propaganda that you'll find online. But I can't do this alone, and my guest this week is returning guest Stephen Van Doren. Stephen, welcome back to Weekly Trek.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
All right, Stephen. Well, you know the drill. I want to know something that's got you feeling excited about Star Trek at the moment. What's got you moving at Warp 10?
Well, I hate to be the bearer of some shameless self-promotion.
Of course. Hit me with it.
At the end of last year, there was this marvelous piece of fan fiction that came out. It's called Edge of Midnight, and it follows the Federation Klingon Cold War of 2256 to 2293. And I muscled into the DMs of the author with a recording of the prologue saying, "Can I please record this for you?" And he very graciously let me do so. And so I am nearly finished with that. I just recorded the 9th chapter, 9 of 10, last night. So right now that has got me blasting away. It's such a wonderful read. I recommend everyone get the book and then listen to my version.
Yes, former Weekly Trek guest, TrekCore's own and iQuick Star Trek podcast co-host Jack Conker, right?
You got it.
Oh yes, I am eagerly awaiting a print copy and I guess now the audiobook version of The Edge of Midnight as well.
I believe the first 3 chapters have been released.
Very nice. Oh, I'll have to go check that out.
Yeah. So it's been a lot of fun. And not to mention it, just the process of doing that and sort of doing a work that I can allow to, because the author allows it, give it out to everyone. It inspired me to actually start up streaming actual audiobook production of other projects that I can do that with, mostly public domain. And so that's kicked me off in a whole other sort of thing. So it's been a wild time thus far, getting to learn all that stuff in the streaming world and video production and all that.
That is very, very cool. I like that. Well, let me tell you what I'm feeling good about Star Trek this week, which is I have stumbled into a rewatch of Star Trek The Next Generation. So,
oh, a fine thing.
I know. So anybody who listens to this show, just in last week's episode, I talked about how I had reached the end of a full franchise rewatch for the 55th anniversary. It took me a year and a half to complete it. And I was all ready to move on and do something other than Star Trek for a little bit. But I have a very good friend who's also very smart, who told me that they had started their own kind of mini Next Generation rewatch in anticipation of Star Trek Picard Season 3, where you basically just pick an episode you like, and then you go down the list until you find another episode you like, and then you go down the list until you find another episode you like. But start with Season 1 and then do it in order all the way through to the end.
Yes.
And because I like to shamelessly steal ideas that I think are good and then pass them off as my own, I decided earlier this week I was sitting down and I was like, what do I want to watch? And I went, you know what? I think I want to watch Encounter at Farpoint. And when I got to the end of Encounter at Farpoint, I was like, I think I'll find the next episode that I enjoy and I'll watch that one. It's sort of not with the intent of kind of stumbling into doing a full Next Generation rewatch. And in fairness to myself, I have not watched every episode so far, but
there are some episodes that are worth ignoring.
Sure, there sure are. There are some easy skips in Season 1, I'll put it that way.
Right.
But honestly, I have skipped fewer than I thought. I was like, oh yeah, I bet I'll end up doing like 3 or 4 from Season 1. I think I watched at least half the season.
Yeah.
I started off with Season 2 and I've already watched the first 3 episodes. So
I recently did a second season rewatch because something inside of me told me that it was better than what I remembered. Mm-hmm. And going through it, it really is better than I remembered. Yeah. It's shockingly better than I remembered. And I think a lot of that, the animosity I had towards it was because of Pulaski, who I have learned to appreciate far, far more.
Yes. Season 2 is better than everybody says it is.
Yes.
It's not as good as season 3, but it's way better than season 1.
Yes.
And so I who knows how far I'll get through the series by February 16th, the drop date for the Star Trek Picard season 3 premiere. But hey, I'm enjoying it.
Especially as the density of good episodes goes up.
So that's the thing, right? Like, you know, from my season ranking that I gave the top 5 from last week, my second highest season in all of Star Trek is TNG season 3. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like I'm probably not going to skip many episodes there. Like season 1, I probably got through quicker than any of the other season. So yes, I think I will definitely start to slow down quite a bit at this stage, but that's okay because I'm having a good time and that's what matters.
Exactly.
All right. Well, with that, let's turn to the week's top stories.
There's a war going on, and I'm a reporter.
Well, while we are all very excited for the upcoming 3rd season of Star Trek Picard, that's not the only new Star Trek on the way this year. And at this year's TrekTalks 2 telethon, hosted by the Trek Geeks Network and the Roddenberry Podcast Network, which raised over $100,000 for John Billingsley's Hollywood Food Coalition, cast and creatives of Star Trek Lower Decks and Star Trek Strange New Worlds offered some tantalizing hints about what to expect from the upcoming season. Beginning with Lower Decks, showrunner and creator Mike McMahon teased a little about the 4th season of the show, which is expected to premiere later this year. We are working hard on season 4. I think it's our best season yet. It's our funniest, it's our most dramatic, it's our most T'Lyn-filled. I'm just loving it, he said. A few other hints about the upcoming season include, quote, there's an amazing episode where we go to Orion, which I have been dying to do for so long. There's a very romantic episode. It's almost like a Valentine's Day episode, but I'm not going to reveal if kissing happens in it because it will give away what happens. There's a wedding in season 4. Brace yourself, get on your Worf wedding attire and look forward to that. The wedding of the season is coming. And as to whether the villainous peanut hamper might make a return in season 4, McMahon said, quote, in season 4 you will see more peanut hamper. I don't think she will get another full standalone peanut hamper style episode, but you get a really fun, good peanut hamper story in season 4. In the interview, McMahon also talked about the evolution of the show, the way in which the series' Easter eggs were just meant to be inside jokes for the animators, and they never expected fans to pick them up in the way that they have, and that the show was originally designed to be more like a traditional animated comedy, where the characters don't change all that much, but that philosophy has clearly changed over time for Lower Decks. Stephen, are you looking forward to Star Trek Lower Decks Season 4?
Well, I'm of the, I think, logical majority, really, who believes that Lower Decks is distilled perfect Star Trek. And so I could not be happier for season 4. I think it is the absolute culmination of all possible Star Trek stories and opportunities and takes, and they can sum it up so well. So I'm very excited about that. Not to mention those little drops that he gave there, the weddings, the visit to Orion, and peanut hamper. That by itself generated a whole bunch of thoughts, because I thought weddings have been throughout all sorts of Star Trek episodes, and they often end up being incredibly important to the plot line. I was thinking of like Riker and Troy's starting nemesis, Lwaxana and Campio, and that whole, mostly I love that because of Tony Jay, who was a marvelous voice actor. But then you think Balance of Terror started with a wedding. Data's Day was all about a wedding. Call to Arms was kind of the B story, was a wedding. You Are Cordially Invited, of course, a wedding. I mean, it's amazing when you actually think about it. There's weddings all over the place in Star Trek. It's crazy. Although hopefully it's not a totally cliched one. Or if it is, I hope it's incredibly cliched.
Yes, absolutely.
Might as well make it A to Z.
Where do you fall on Peanut Hamper? Love her or loathe her?
I have a caveat attached to that. I would have preferred that being the end of the story. You know, being locked away in self-aware megalomaniacal computer storage is, I think, a period. And I would have been totally okay with that as the end point. If she comes back, I hope it's in a redemption arc and it's an actual redemption. You know, not one that's like the previous one.
Yeah. Presumably we would have Jeffrey Combs back though as well. So not all bad.
Well, only if it's an actual redemption arc wherein he can just stay back and she finds her way to the righteousness.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to Lower Decks Season 4. I'm looking for the direction they take it in. I love they're going to do a wedding episode. I can't wait to kind of see Mathematically Perfect Redemption as a love it or hate it episode.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the prospect for the way in which it builds upon the sort of series' own canon to continue that story a little bit with, now a potential team up between Peanut Hamper and Agamus. So yeah, like I'm excited for this. And I also find it really interesting the comments that Mike made about sort of the evolution of the show, right? That it sort of was originally intended to be more sort of Simpsons-esque.
It is often the case with incredibly creative people who are generating these stories that the characters become alive themselves. And, you can't help but say, oh, well, I have to honor that and, build them out as what they are demanding. So I've heard that frequently from authors saying, oh, yeah, I came up with the basic thing. The story took off from there. I just transcribed it.
Yeah, and I can't recall if it was in this interview or if it was somewhere else. He kind of talked about how he'd had a different idea originally for Rutherford's backstory, but then this one sort of arrived and, he sort of decided that it was better and therefore scrap the original plans. So it's interesting to hear the way in which the show itself has sort of evolved over time now that they have been around long enough for it to have evolved.
Right.
And also interesting to kind of see like sort of what then becomes the end point, right? Like, so if the characters are on a journey of development and changing, how much of that sort of happens within the course of Star Trek Lower Decks itself? I mean, of course, that question is partially answered by how long does Star Trek Lower Decks go on for, right? Like how many more seasons? But I wonder if Mike himself has sort of thought, okay, I kind of have in my head, if everything goes according to the way I would like it to go, this is sort of where I would like the characters to end up by the time Lower Decks itself takes a bow.
Right. Well, I mean, I invoke this series hesitantly because of where it is at this point, but I've fielded mentally the idea that Lower Decks is kind of The Simpsons if The Simpsons were written in the Star Trek world. So I think that is kind of like the cartoon that Picard watched when he was young, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The bad reference, The Simpsons, they've lingered for too long, some could argue, and so perhaps not quite that long. But I think animation in itself and the idea of Lower Decks has such legs on it that I think it could go much further than they think. It would be nice to see how far they could let it go.
Yeah, I agree. Like, my sort of sense of it is let them go as long as they want to. And, I don't particularly feel beholden to like 7 seasons as any sort of barometer for anything, given the seasons themselves are so much shorter, right? If Lower Decks goes 7 seasons, it will only have done 70 episodes, which will be just over 3 seasons. Did I get my math right? It'd be about exactly 3 seasons
of the old ways.
Right? So they could presumably do, what does that mean? They could then go up to like 21 seasons and they would get to the same number of episodes as like 14, 15 to get to the same number of episodes. As you can tell, I'm terrible at math.
No, you're okay.
Get to the same level of episodes as, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. So yeah, like bring it on.
Yeah, I'd be okay with that.
Well, and in addition to Star Trek Lower Decks, Star Trek Strange New Worlds star Anson Mount also appeared at the TrekTalks 2 telethon and had a little to say about the show's upcoming 2nd season. Mount says to expect a season 2 that pushes the boundary of Star Trek even more than season 1. I think we gained some latitude from the scenes that worked that maybe some people weren't so sure about that ended up working really well, he said. We got to really go for it this season, so there are some episodes that have never been tried before. So for instance, the one that's already been announced, the crossover with Lower Decks, is tremendous fun and straight up comedy, and we had a blast with it. And he went on to say that, quote, "That's not even the craziest thing we did. There's one episode I'm thinking of towards the end of the season, and you'll know when you see it, where it required us to work many weekends. But we were so excited about it, it was not laborious. We were excited to show up for Sunday rehearsals and all the things we're having to do to pull together this one episode. We're really excited about it." And summing up the season as a whole, Mount said, quote, "We're not telling stories without telling stories about character, and that's really what season 2 is about. But that also means bigger science fiction ideas, bigger, stranger worlds, crazier things. We try a couple of things that have never been done on Trek before, for, personally, I believe, successfully. And I'm working with the legendary Carol Kane, who is joining the show this season as the new Enterprise Chief Engineer. Mount said, quote, "She is lovely. I love working with her. Obviously, I've been a fan of hers my entire life. So when I saw her, I was like, what? That's crazy." And I was so excited, and it's so out of left field, but she is so much fun to work with because she has this quality about her where she's been doing this for decades. And she has this thing where she never assumes she knows how it's done. And I don't know how she manages to retain that sense of purity in any given scene. She's consistently happy and funny and makes the most interesting choices. We have been so lucky to have her. Stephen, any thoughts about what you might like to see Star Trek Strange New Worlds tackle in season 2?
Well, I mean, it has to be a musical episode, doesn't it?
Right?
It has to be.
The idea of doing Sunday rehearsals for something.
Yeah,
when I read that, I was just like, oh, it has to be a musical.
And I would love that. And with that cast, I don't think, of the options of all the casts currently going, talented though they all are, I think that one is the one that is most, I don't want to say aimed at, but it seems like it'll be the best fit for them to do a musical sort of episode. And with dancing and singing, oh, that would be great.
Yeah. So I read this and I was like, okay, what could be crazier than an animated crossover? And then I started to think about, okay, well, in this, he talks about, doing a lot of rehearsing, Sunday rehearsals, weekend rehearsals. And I'm like, what for television would require that sort of thing? And, then I was like, well, realistically, let's think about this. What would require a level of extra preparation where you would need to have a bunch of actors in and you would give it that title of a rehearsal? Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, well, there's a few possible options, right? Option number one, some particularly big action set piece that has lots of moving pieces to it and lots of potential sort of choreography, which I don't mean in sort of the dancing way, but I mean in sort of like the stunts way. And it just requires a ton of preparation. So you kind of have to really lean into it. And then I was like, well, does a giant action set piece sound like it fits the bill for what Anson has described, right? In terms of being crazier and trying things they've never done on Star Trek before. And I'm like, no, not really, right? You can look at some really kind of innovative stunt work that has taken place on Discovery, particularly. I just did the Trek Core screen caps for Anomaly today. And, the scenes where the crew all get lifted into the air and then back down again. Or I'm thinking about things like Such Sweet Sorrow Part 2, where Michelle Yeoh fights with Leland in the corridor, and they built a corridor and they spun it around because the gravity was going haywire. So okay, so I don't think you'd say that if it was just some big action set piece,
right?
But as you say, right, something that requires a level of rehearsing, to my mind, that says, all right, well, you've got actors in a room and you've got to get it right, and it's not the kind of thing you can just come in and reliably do once on the first take. Sounds like, as a reformed high school theater kid, although one who told his drama teachers that he would never sing on stage, and I mostly managed to abide by that. That sounds like singing to me, right?
Yeah.
That sounds like something that requires that level of extra preparation that as a performer, right, like this cast, you would be excited about the prospect of coming in on a Sunday to do, because you're doing a musical. And so, I kind of think maybe they're doing a musical episode this season. And we're not in the wishful theory section, but we've both come to the same conclusion at the same time that I now feel pretty strongly.
Well, I only have
you do too.
One other idea, and this one sits just on it's way down the list. If it's a list of two, it's way down that list of two. So the only other thing I can think of that would require extra amounts of rehearsal would be something that requires, say, animals. And
possibly.
If there's a Western episode, they have not done Western episodes.
Okay, horses,
so that would be kind of, maybe they interact on a planet where the only way they can go about is by horse, and so they have to do that. Could be, maybe they have a shootout at the saloon or something, because they've tried before, but a fistful of dishes doesn't count.
But North Star's excellent.
Yes, that's true.
Oh, yeah. I had not thought about a Western episode, which also, and I should have, because I think, and I apologize if you were this previous guest on a recent episode, someone suggested a Western episode for season 2 of Strange New Worlds, given, it's Anson Mount. He fits that sort of classic Western.
Well, and he started the season on a horse. The very
Yes,
first season.
right, exactly. Well, and he just sort of like, if we moved him back through time 50 years and he was in Hollywood, of course he'd be in all the Westerns, right? Like he's just that kind of, you know, he's got that sort of that bearing and that voice and that accent that just sort of lends itself to Westerns. And so I would be really shocked if we get to the end of Stranger Worlds and there isn't a Western episode that lets Anson kind of lean into the horses and the, you know, the drawl that he had in the in Equality of Mercy is the older version of Pike, right? Which was, I mean, that was real John Wayne if ever I heard it. Yeah, okay, yeah. So maybe, yeah. I had not thought about that. I think I'm still on the musical train, just because I think that's from the perspective of talking about it being both crazy and something Star Trek's never done before. A musical definitely fits that bill. But I think your kind of conceit for how a Western episode works is probably also a conceit for how a musical episode works, which is you're at a planet and the culture communicates in song. And so you have to communicate in song too in order to, you know, communicate with them.
I was just assuming they'd bump into another nebula that changes reality.
Yeah, which, I mean, you know, there's lots of ways to back into that, I think. So anyway, 10 episodes, and we know one of them's Lower Deck Strange New Worlds crossover. We know another of them has this sort of crazy level of preparation associated with it. So yeah, I think I'm very much looking forward to Strange New Worlds season 2. I hope it follows right on the heels of Picard season 3.
I'm hoping so as well. I wish they would get around to announcing these things.
Yeah, as I talked about in last week's episode, I mean, obviously now it's January 21st, but I wouldn't not be shocked if soon we do get a couple more release dates for later in the year of when Stranger World Season 2, Discovery Season 5 might be coming. My guess is those will take up the next 33 weeks because we've got those, and it's 3 weeks till Picard season 3, but we'll see.
Well, I think Terry Matalas has confirmed, quote unquote, that the next trailer is going to be on Super Bowl Sunday. So they're probably waiting to release information on the other shows until after that furor can be milked as long as possible.
Not Super Bowl Sunday. It will be the National Championship game, which is January 29th.
I don't know football. CBS. I apologize.
Yeah, no. You're all good. Super Bowl Sunday is February 11th, which is only like 4 days before the show premieres.
Oh, that's too late.
Yes, but I believe it's the NFC Championship game is Sunday the 29th. And yes, there's supposed to be a Picard yes, Terry has so strongly hinted as to almost outright come out and say that, well, he has gone so far as to say that there will be one more trailer, that it will premiere during a football game, and there is a very big football game on CBS, which is obviously the studio that's part of Paramount, on January 29th. So I think that's when everybody is expecting the last Picard Season 3 trailer to come out. Well, and looking back in time a little, Star Trek Enterprise star Scott Bakula also made a pretty rare public appearance to talk about Star Trek at also TrekTalks 2 and reflected on the legacy of Star Trek Enterprise. Had we been syndicated, we would have gotten an easy 7, easy breezy, he said, and our numbers were beyond what anybody else had done when we started out. But the nature of network television, it was just a different animal. There were lots of changes in the hierarchy of not only Paramount, but of the network, and we were there at a kind of unfortunate time. And yet I still have to say, gratefully, we got 4 seasons. But yeah, it would have been nice to do more. We certainly had more stories to tell. We had places to go, but it didn't work out. Bakula also talked about how pleased he was that new fans have discovered the show since it went off the air in 2005. When we were in the midst of making the show, and when we got our 4th season done, we all talked about hoping that the show would be more appreciated as time went on, because I felt like we achieved something pretty wonderful in those 4 years, especially, in my opinion, in the last 2.5 years. That kind of building through the Xindi element, and with the 9/11 component fusing the writers' brains and minds and hearts. We were always hopeful, all of us. We had done a lot of good work, and we would hope that we would be appreciated as time marched on. I am thrilled. And as to whether Bakula would consider appearing in Star Trek again in one of the current productions, quote, I've been doing this too long to ever say never or no to anybody. I talk to everybody about stuff, so sure. Stephen, would you like to see Scott Bakula back in Star Trek?
I would, but I think, unfortunately, it's a role that would have to be small. And so I think it would have to fit into, as in Lower Decks, the way Zephram Cochrane did when they brought James Cromwell back to do some of the extra speaking, which I think they did for Enterprise as well. But, because the character of Archer is so iconic and important, I don't think without giving him his own show, you can't really just have him. It would be like recasting Kirk and then giving him a new show just because William Shatner is, not acting anymore, I don't think. But it just seems like the role itself is too large for him to come back, for anyone to come back to, just because it's so foundational for the Federation, short of giving him his own show. So that would be fine, but I don't think that's really in the cards.
Yeah, I don't think I want a Leonard McCoy in Encounter at Farpoint, right?
Right.
That feels too small. It's Scott Bakula. He's still popular and in demand, still working a lot, still a great actor. And, there are parts of Archer's story which sadly remain untold in some ways. And so I don't think I want to go through all that effort for just the level of cameo that DeForest Kelley had in the series premiere of Star Trek The Next Generation, which I guess Encounter at Farpoint's on my brain for the reason we talked about earlier. What I think I would be okay with, though, would be something like a Unification 1 and 2, right? A couple of episodes of one of the current shows, which is constructed around Archer and something to do with Archer's story. Obviously, for all of the shows, it would have to involve some level of time travel.
No, just present him as a hologram. We won't have a problem with that, right?
Yeah, but I would want the character, and I would want it to be, I feel like I don't want Archer to sort of come forward in time or sort of be some historical representation of the character. I feel like I want our characters to go back in time to him and to meet him in his world rather than have him come to ours. I guess the only circumstances under which I might be okay with him coming to ours, quote unquote, would be, and I don't think I like this idea, but Brian Braga has always talked about the idea of, and I don't know how much this was sort of something that was on their minds during the show or if this was something he came up with more afterwards as a way of sort of having an answer to the question that was not a boring answer, but this idea that Future Guy in Enterprise is a future version of Jonathan Archer. That could be interesting, right? If there's some kind of tie-in, obviously Discovery's a bit past the temporal wars and the timeline, but if Archer is on his way to becoming Future Guy at some later point in his life or some alternate version, that could be interesting. Sort of in the same way that they were planning to bring William Shatner back for Enterprise Season 5, right? It was not going to be our James T. Kirk. It was going to be Mirror Kirk, who had been zapped by the Tantalus field and appears in the Prime timeline. And then that's where we meet, William Shatner playing Mirror Kirk. I'd be okay with Scott Bakula playing an evil alternate Jonathan Archer or something like that, right? But because it still sort of ties into the milieu of Star Trek Enterprise, right? The story of that show specifically.
Right.
And that's sort of what I want, right? If I'm going to get Scott Bakula back, and of course, almost certainly never going to get him back in a show that is an Enterprise sequel, then whatever show it is he does appear in, that show should sort of become co-opted into being an Enterprise show for whatever period of time he's there, because I think that's the level of respect that he's due, in sort of the same way that, as I say, for Unification, right? That became a Spock vehicle for a couple of episodes. Obviously had great stuff for our existing characters. It was very much a Next Generation episode, but it still serviced that character specifically rather than having the character sort of be a throwaway addition to a story for one of the others. So anyway.
Right. No, I agree. If he's going to be in, he should be a substantive plot point as opposed to a nod. I agree.
So those are our terms for Scott Bakula's return. So if anybody from Star Trek production is listening to this, just know those are our red lines.
Hear ye, hear ye.
Well, and lastly this week, Titan Books have announced the latest in their series of Star Trek autobiographies. Coinciding with the 30th anniversary of Star Trek Deep Space Nine this year, Titan will release the autobiography of Benjamin Sisko. The book joins the already published autobiographies for James T. Kirk, Jean-Luc Picard, Spock, and Catherine Janeway. The autobiography will be written by previous Star Trek author Derek Tyler Attico, and the synopsis for the book reads, quote, "Discover the hidden history of his childhood and early career in Starfleet and the innermost thoughts of the man who discovered the Gamma Quadrant, made first contact with the wormhole aliens, and united Starfleet, Klingon, and Romulan forces to defeat the Dominion. See Sisko's personal take on his confidants, Lieutenant Dax and Major Kira Reese, the enigmatic Garrick, and his adversaries Gul Dukat and Kai Wynn, as well as his fatherly advice for his son Jake." The book is expected later this year. Stephen, are you excited for the autobiography of Benjamin Sisko? And have you read any of the other books in the autobiography line?
I have not had the opportunity to read the others. That's a personal failing that comes with having an audiobook job. I read books all day long, so it's very difficult to summon the energy when I'm done. But I'm very interested in this one, and I may even pick it up and check it out. I'm excited to hear Sisko's narrative voice being presented again. It's one of those that I would oddly say should never be made into an audiobook, because I don't think we'd get Avery Brooks to narrate it, and he's the only one who could, to match the correct phrasing of how he speaks and all that. And knowing that he has a very unique voice as a character, I wanted to know if Derek Tyler Attico, the author, has the clementines to handle that. So I looked into his stories that he had won those. He won the Strange New Worlds writing contest in 2016, so the last one that happened, and then once in 2005. The one he wrote for 2016 follows Cassidy Yates with her son being captured by the cult of the Pa-Wraiths, and Kira Nerys goes with the Defiant to go save him. And simultaneously, the B story is a Benny Russell story where Benny Russell decides to write his final Star Trek story. So I think just knowing the basic structure of just that story, I feel very confident with what he's going to write. I'm very much looking forward to see what he comes up with.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with the author choice, obviously. There are, sadly, are not many. In fact, I think there is one published Black author in the Star Trek fiction realm, and that's Derek Tyler Attico, who won 2 of the Strange New Worlds fiction contests. And so, yeah, this was a book that from the start of the line, there was obviously a clamoring for, but also like so David Goodman wrote the autobiographies of James T. Kirk and Jean-Luc Picard, and then Una McCormack took over and did Spock and Catherine Janeway. And so it was like, well, David A. Goodman probably shouldn't be the person writing Benjamin Sisko's story, given, there is that sort of really strong tie into the heritage of Ben Sisko as being important to the character, the race of Ben Sisko being important to the character, and, some of the experiences that the character had, they sort of need to be written in an authentic voice, not an assumed voice of talking about, difficulties that Black people have faced. And so, yeah, I think it's great. And I think Derek pitched himself for the job a few years ago, right? Basically being like, I think I'm the only Star Trek author who is Black. I think I'm the natural person to write this. I'd like to write this. And I'm really pleased that it's ultimately come together. I've been a big fan of all of these books. The James T. Kirk one is great, but Kirk had the sort of part of what I like is the books to sort of provide an opportunity to explore parts of the character's life that we don't see on screen.
Right.
And obviously we see so much of James T. Kirk's life on screen. The Picard book's really interesting because it was written and published before Star Trek Picard was announced. So it is a completely different telling of Picard's life after Star Trek Nemesis, because Star Trek Picard had not been invented when David Goodman wrote that book. So if you are looking for an alternate take on the rest of Picard's life, or maybe you're, perhaps not the biggest fan of Star Trek Picard, but you'd like a story for Picard's kind of life after All Good Things, you can find that in the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard. And then Una McCormack's Spock autobiography, also excellent. Kind of this sort of the same issue with the Kirk biography, actually maybe even slightly more than that. We really know the full history of Spock's life, right? We've seen his childhood, we've seen his young adulthood, we've seen portions of all of his experiences on the Enterprise. We know what happens after he leaves the Enterprise, and we know how he ultimately dies. So we really have seen the full life arc, but it's still an excellent book.
Well, Una McCormack is an amazing writer.
Yes, she is. And then the Catherine Janeway book is excellent as well. And the only one that has, obviously, because Leonard Nimoy is no longer with us, and Kate Mulgrew did do a reading of the autobiography of Catherine Janeway. That was an official one for Titans. You can get it on audible.com. It's basically the audiobook for that autobiography is written by Kate Mulgrew.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah, which is great. So I'm really pleased that, we've got the Benjamin Sisko one coming, and hopefully we'll get Jonathan Archer after that, and hopefully potentially Michael Burnham after that, and we'll be pretty set at that point, I think, with most of the main characters, and then maybe, I guess, Christopher Pike after that.
Well, we may well have new ones by then.
Yes, we certainly may, because time continues apace and Star Trek don't seem like it's slowing down.
Hopefully not.
All right, well, we've talked about the facts, and now let's speculate on what's going to happen in the future of Star Trek.
You make some very good points, Captain. But it's still all speculation and theory.
So each week, my guest and I give you a wish or theory we're nurturing about any of the shows or the future of the franchise. So, Stephen, let's hear your theory or wish for this week.
Okay, so I want an anthology series. I want Star Trek to tackle the stories that are too small for a series and potentially too small for an entire season, but still too large for one episode, that we can follow things that we haven't seen before. And I think the way that Star Trek Picard has played out helps give credit to that, because it sort of feels like almost an anthology series.
Sure.
Because the three are so disconnected.
Yeah.
And this most recent one coming feels very much like, you know, let's mostly ignore all that's happened so far. We have this other story we want to tell, which is, you know, I think that's good. But that plus short treks, plus how Strange New Worlds has handled single stories that are, you know, entirely contained, I think Section 31 show would work much better as an anthology, you know, one of these many, many stories. And there's so many that they could do. We could, you know, go through the rise of Navarre, or, you know, follow a Trill through its entire multiple lifetime life, you know. We could do anything Romulan, please, anything Romulan. You know, there's so many out there, but they can't really have their own Star Trek show. So there should be one that's, maybe it's a cadre of actors that they keep bringing back for every season, and they just recast them into different roles, like American Horror Story. And of course, that would, of course, demand Jeffrey Combs. But that's my hope, that that's what they're learning from, not only from Strange New Worlds, but from the success of this upcoming Picard season, that they can tell a shorter story and just let us have it. It doesn't have to be everything.
Yeah, I like that. Supposedly that was the original pitch that Brian Fuller had for Star Trek Discovery.
Right, yeah.
And there were rumors at the time that his pitch for the show was an anthology show, and then that sort of went away and everyone was like, oh, you know, that was, to use a term that was more common at the time, fake news. But then in recent years, it sort of has been like confirmed by people who were sort of attached to the production at the time that yes, that was the very original concept. They very quickly kind of moved away from the anthology show, but that,
and I think they were right with that cast, and that where they've gone with it, they've taken it in the correct way. But an anthology series would just, it's begging to be told. We don't need, you know, multiple seasons following one character. Just tell the shorter stories. It's okay.
Yeah. I mean, especially from the perspective of there's so many parts of the Star Trek universe that you could explore in more detail.
And that would be perfect for, say, an Archer story.
Right.
Bring him back for an anthology.
Yeah.
That'd be perfect.
Yeah, you know, sort of like an anthology series. Or the other thing that I had sort of been thinking about was like them doing some miniseries, right? Which is basically, I was saying the same thing.
Yeah.
They would just be separately branded rather than all under one kind of, you know, sort of series brand.
Right.
But yeah, like you could do that, right? Come back for an Archer miniseries, or do the Section 31 show as a miniseries, right? With Michelle Yeoh being so in demand at the moment. It seems unlikely, candidly, as much as they keep saying that Section 31 continues to be in development, which they said right after Michelle Yeoh won her Golden Globe a couple of weeks ago, that, you know, some Paramount executives said, confirmed, yes, Section 31 still in development. It's like, all right, guys, like, you know, how long are we going to keep this up? But, you know, she is in very high demand, and so getting her for a full show is probably not practical, but maybe getting her to come back for a Section 31 miniseries, you know, could be.
Yeah.
And then a Scott Bakula Archer miniseries, and a somebody else miniseries, and a something else miniseries, and, you know, all of that. That'd be terrific.
Yeah, I'm totally in favor of that.
All right, let me give you my theory, which is I'm going to lay my cards on the table and say which other legacy actors from the Star Trek franchise, beyond the ones that have already been announced, will be appearing in Star Trek Picard Season 3.
Oh.
So, okay, here we go. So I have 4 names of actors that I think will have some level of appearance in Star Trek Picard Season 3. So who is not eligible for me to pick? So not eligible for me to pick is anybody who's already appeared in Star Trek Picard Seasons 1 or 2. So no Guinan, no Q, and nobody who has already been shown in trailer or publicity materials for Star Trek Picard Season 3. So obviously I'm not going to pick Daniel Davis as Moriarty. Why? Because we already know he's in it.
Right.
Obviously 7 cast members for Star Trek The Next Generation not eligible to pick because we know they're already in it. Okay, so my 4 are, I'm just going to say them. I've commit them to the world. Michelle Forbes reprising her role as Ro Laren. Dwight Schultz reprising his role as Reginald Barclay. Nana Visitor reprising her role as Kira Nerys. And my biggest swing for the fences, Kate Mulgrew reprising her role as Catherine Janeway. That's my guess. We know there are more. They have explicitly said there are more. So we know that more are appearing. And Terry has also said, he said two things. He has said there are more Next Generation legacy characters who appear in Star Trek Picard Season 3 beyond the ones we already know about. And two, that Star Trek Picard Season 3 is a continuation of Deep Space Nine and Voyager as well.
Right.
So we know there are more Next Generation legacy characters appearing. What's not a deep, deep bench, because he's already ruled out some people. Colin Meaney will not be appearing in Star Trek Picard Season 3, so no Miles O'Brien, which almost certainly means, in my mind, no Rosalind Chow either as Keiko O'Brien. So those are two recurring characters who are out. No Diana Muldaur as Catherine Pulaski. He said no Pulaski in Star Trek Picard Season 3. Not a huge surprise. Diana Muldaur is now well on her way to her mid-90s. So, let's let the woman kind of be retired in peace. And she didn't particularly like the cast of Next Generation. And they didn't particularly like her. So people who got mad about Catherine Pulaski not being in Star Trek Picard Season 3 can go suck an egg as far as I'm concerned. So,
agreed.
And Moriarty already in it. So then it's like, okay, well, who else are those characters that are like big characters that you can think of from the show who we've not seen yet? And for my mind, Michelle Forbes and Ro Laren, if you could get her to say yes, is an absolute no-brainer. And he has talked about how there is one legacy character that he was desperate to get a hold of, which implied that there was a level of difficulty associated with securing that person's participation. Well, that sounds like the actress who turned down being on Deep Space Nine to me. So that'd be Michelle Forbes. Obviously, if you're then going by kind of characters who've made sheer number of appearances who have not already been disqualified from consideration, Dwight Schultz and Reginald Barclay are way high on that list.
Yeah.
And, we've not seen Dwight in much. I think he's a bit of a right-wing lunatic these days, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I'm sure he's always been a right-wing lunatic, but he is a particularly public right-wing lunatic these days. That does not necessarily mean that they would not have talked to Dwight about potentially coming back as Barclay. So important to the franchise, not just the Next Generation, but also his appearances in Voyager as well. Right? A really key character, would not shock me at all.
Right. And importantly, he's shown that he's willing to do crossovers.
Exactly. So then 3 Nana Visitor. So now we're getting into the okay, those previous. I feel really good about Michelle Forbes. I think I'm going to be shocked if we get to the end of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard and Michelle Forbes does not make an appearance. I will be not. I'm 50-50 on Dwight Schultz. I think there's just as good of a chance that he appears as there is a chance that he doesn't appear. Now we're in the ones where I'm like, these feel like more reaches. So Terry's talked about Picard Season 3 being a continuation of Deep Space Nine in sort of a substantive way. And I think there are two ways that can be accomplished. One is obviously they've got Worf, right? Worf is a Deep Space Nine character in addition to being a Next Generation character. And he's more recently a Deep Space Nine character than he is a Next Generation character. And so you could easily play out a number of themes from Deep Space Nine and a number of ideas, or kind of continue to tell some of the story of what happened after the Dominion War exclusively through Worf. You wouldn't necessarily need another Deep Space Nine character to do that. It could just be Worf is there as Deep Space Nine Worf and less as Next Generation Worf, and therefore that's our Deep Space Nine connection in a really serious way. But I don't know. I just kind of have this feeling that they want to go further and they want to do more. And so that says to me that maybe there's another Deep Space Nine character who appears. And to me, Nana Visitor, Alexander Siddig. I don't think Armin Shimmerman would do it because of the makeup. I don't know Andy Robinson would do it because of the makeup. Nicole de Boer would probably do it. Sirach Lofton might do it, but I don't necessarily see Jake needing to interact with the Next Generation crew. So I kind of just come back to Nana Visitor. Clearly, obviously very up for a Star Trek appearance, just did Lower Decks.
Right.
And, it is a great actor. I think would fall really quickly back into the role of Kira. And Kira's so important to Deep Space Nine as a whole that if you're going to have a Deep Space Nine character, Kira's an obvious one. For me, that really feels like somebody who could really represent that show on Star Trek Picard. And then Kate Mulgrew, I think, is the biggest reach just because she's already on Prodigy. And I think there'd be an element of kind of I don't think this would ever happen, but I think they would think this, an element of Kate Mulgrew oversaturation, or Kate Mulgrew thinking there was an element of Kate Mulgrew oversaturation or Janeway oversaturation. And, you know, Kate, like every actor gets asked, oh, do you think you'd be in Star Trek again? Or if they're doing the animation, do you think you'd do the live action again? And, you know, some of them have been like, yeah, maybe. And of course, they have already said yes, right? The Next Generation stars, that was them for the year prior to the announcement they were going to be in Picard season 3. Do you think you'd be in Picard? Well, yeah, maybe, even though they've already signed the dotted line and in some cases even filmed a bunch of stuff. So Kate's answers about returning to live action can obviously be taken with a grain of salt, but at the same time, they also feel, to me, having heard them, they feel pretty authentic of like, no, I haven't been, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to. But that could also be a lie, and for the purposes of this theory, I'm choosing to believe it is a lie, and that Seven has there's a cameo appearance for Kate Mulgrew as Janeway, and a lovely moment with Jerry Ryan's 7 of 9. And yes, so Michelle Forbes, Dwight Schultz, Danavis, Kate Mulgrew. Stephen, what do you think?
I did not even imagine that we could get a conclusion to Ro Laren's story, but that is now my number one hope. Thank you for planting that. I would love to see that. And knowing only the visual style of the images thus far given to us, it seems like there might be some shady dealings. And if she's still dealing shadily with the remnants of the Maquis, whatever they are or whatever they're doing, whatever she's doing is probably not Starfleet oriented. So maybe they need that sort of assistance. It might be an interesting way to bring her in. But to get any conclusion to that would be so great, because short of Data, Picard, I don't think had a more meaningful relationship with anyone besides, Crusher, of course, you know, the lifetime's worth. But other than Data and Ro, it was such a raw, you know, pure relationship that broke so abruptly and so effectively that I would love to see where it goes. So I'm with you on there. And I think Dwight Schultz would be welcome, but you're right. He might not be willing to step into that sort of environment these days. I don't know, but that would be interesting. And yeah, I think there's probably some degree of people who wear suits every day who would say, no, there's simply too much Kate Mulgrew right now. We can't add her to another show. I mean, they're idiots, but I'm okay with Kate Mulgrew in every show.
Agreed.
You know, just a little part if she wants, just to do a little thing. That's fine. Cool. You can be on any show she wants.
Do you have a theory or a wish for Discovery, Picard, Strange New Worlds, Lower Decks, or Prodigy that you'd like to share? Tweet them to me at WeeklyTrek, or email them to me at weeklytrek@thetricordertransmissions.com, and I might feature your theory in a future episode. Well, that's all the time we've got for this episode of Weekly Trek. Thank you so much to my guest, Stephen Van Doren, for joining me today. Stephen, how can people contact you if they want to continue the conversation?
Well, you're happy to find me on Twitter at @SVanDoren, or you can see me on Twitch at @SVanDoren, or on YouTube at @SVanDoren.
And you can find this show on Twitter at Weekly Trek and me at Alexander T. Perry. And if you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your podcast player of choice. And please check out some of the other great shows on the Tricorder Transmissions. And if you like our shows, please also consider becoming a Patreon of Tricorder, which you can find at patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. And lastly, if you're looking for Star Trek news on the internet, I hope you will turn to trekcore.com. Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you to all of my listeners. And until next week, live long and prosper.